Rome did not just ban a party, it cracked down on a god. And the reason was not drunken chaos alone. It was fear of a secret network moving in the dark. Today, you're going to see why the Roman state publicly shut down the cult of Bacchus, the god of wine, and why that decision was so shocking it still feels extreme. You'll get the real story behind the Bacchanalia, the panic in Rome, and the hidden political danger that made a religious festival look like a conspiracy. And later, you'll see why the official explanation may have been only half the truth. At first glance, this sounds simple. Too much wine, too much noise, too much trouble. Rome gets embarrassed, Rome steps in, problem solved. But that version misses the part that made senators panic. Because this was not just one rowdy festival. It was a widespread movement. It had meetings. It had initiates. It had private rituals. And in the Roman mind, anything secret, organized, and emotional could become dangerous very fast. And in a few minutes, you'll see why a religious celebration could look more threatening than a riot. Let's start with what the Romans actually did. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate issued one of the most famous crackdowns in religious history, the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus. That's the Senate's decree against the Bacchanalia. It did not simply ask people to calm down. It restricted gatherings, required official approval, and effectively put the cult under state control. That is a huge move. If this were just about drunken festivals, Rome had seen drunken festivals before. Rome was full of strange rituals, imported gods, and loud public celebrations. The city was not exactly known for being prudish. So, why this one? Because the Bacchanalia were not being treated like a harmless feast anymore. They were being treated like an underground organization. The Romans believed the cult had spread too fast, met too often, and operated too privately. That combination set off alarms. And here's the first important twist. The panic was not only about religion, it was about order. In Rome, religion and politics were never fully separate. A cult could be a social club, a political bloc, or a loyalty network. If people gathered outside normal public control, they could talk, recruit, and coordinate. That was enough to worry the Senate. And one more thing made it worse. The cult was associated with women, slaves, freedmen, and lower-status people. To Roman elites, that meant the social hierarchy was already wobbling. So the first question is not, why did Rome hate wine? The real question is, why did Rome think this wine god was building power? Everyone assumes the Senate just hated pleasure. The truth is sharper. Rome was facing a cult that looked, to elite eyes, like a private society, with secret access, emotional intensity, and cross-class membership. That is exactly the kind of thing a nervous state fears. Now, the main source for this story is the Roman historian Livy, and Livy gives us a dramatic version. He describes nighttime meetings, sexual misconduct, forged wills, false witnesses, and even murder. It sounds like a horror story written by a senator who had had enough. But here's the problem. Livy is not a neutral reporter. He wrote long after the crackdown, and he loved moral drama. So when he describes the Bacchanalia as a den of vice, you have to ask what he is doing politically. He may be preserving real fears, but he is also amplifying them. That matters, because the Senate did not need every accusation to be true. It only needed enough suspicion to justify intervention. and the intervention was intense. The decree required Bacchic gatherings to be approved by the Senate. It limited the number of participants. It restricted who could lead rites. It made the cult visible, countable, and therefore controllable. That's the key move. Rome was not saying, "Stop believing in Bacchus." Rome was saying, "If you worship him, we need to know where, when, and under whose authority." That tells you everything about Roman power. The state was not just suppressing religion. It was absorbing religion into bureaucracy. And there's another twist here. The Bacchanalia were probably not originally a threat at all. Bacchic worship came from the Greek world, where mystery cults promised personal transformation, ecstasy, and a closer relationship with the divine. In Rome, that kind of religion could spread among people who felt shut out of public power. So the cult's appeal may have been exactly what frightened the elite. It offered belonging outside the official system. In 2 minutes, you'll see why that made the Senate's response feel less like a religious reform and more like a political arrest. But first, one question for you. If you were a Roman senator, would you see this as harmless religion or a hidden power network? Drop your answer in the comments. Here's the part nobody talks about. The Bacchanalia crackdown was not just about stopping a cult. It was about defining who gets to gather, who gets to lead, and who gets to create loyalty outside the state. That is the real Roman fear. Because once people meet in secret, share identity, and answer to a leader other than the Senate, the state loses some of its grip. And Rome, especially in the early 2nd century BCE, was expanding fast. Expansion creates pressure. More territory means more people, more cultures, more gods, more uncertainty. So the Senate was trying to do something bigger than stop a festival. It was trying to draw a line around acceptable community. And we can see that in the way the crackdown was framed. The decree did not say Bacchus was fake. It said the cult had to be regulated. That distinction matters. Rome was flexible enough to absorb foreign gods, but only if they could be domesticated. That is Roman religion in one sentence. Include the god. Control the worship. Now compare that to the Bacchic mystery style. Mystery cults were built around secrecy, initiation, and personal experience. You did not just attend, you were changed. That kind of religion created intense loyalty. It made a believer feel chosen, and chosen people can become harder to govern. That is why the Bacchanalia looked dangerous, even if only part of the scandal was real. Let's add a second proof point. The Senate's response was not a one-off outburst. It was legal, administrative, and public. That means the state wanted everyone to see the punishment. It wanted the message to spread farther than the cult itself. The crackdown became a warning to any group that might organize outside the normal channels. So yes, Bacchic rites may have included excess. Yes, there may have been real abuses. But the deeper issue was that Rome saw a social structure it could not fully supervise. That is why this story is so revealing. You are not just looking at a ban on partying. You are looking at an early Roman example of a state saying, private power is getting too private. And that brings us to the biggest irony. The more Rome tried to suppress Bacchic worship, the more it revealed its own anxiety. A confident empire does not need to fear wine rituals this much. A nervous one does. By the way, If this kind of hidden history breakdown is your thing, subscribe. Every week, we dig into the real reasons ancient events happened. Not just the official story, but the power struggle underneath it. And now, the main loop starts closing. Rome shut down the Bacchanalia because it saw three threats at once: uncontrolled gatherings, cross-class loyalty, and a religion that operated beyond public oversight. That combination made a wine cult look like a political problem. So the story is not Rome hated fun. It's Rome feared any movement it could not count, command, or contain. Here's the final reveal. Rome publicly shut down the cult of Bacchus because the Senate believed the cult had become bigger than a festival, bigger than a shrine, and bigger than a god. First, it was a control problem. Secret meetings meant hidden organization. Hidden organization meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant danger. Second, it was a social problem. The cult crossed class lines. That made elites nervous because it blurred the hierarchy Rome depended on. Third, it was a political problem. If people could build loyalty through mystery, emotion, and ritual outside the state, then the Senate was no longer the only source of authority. That is why the crackdown was so public. Rome needed everyone to see that the state still owned the boundaries. And that is also why Bacchus is such a perfect symbol for the story. Wine loosens boundaries. It dissolves restraint. It makes people feel less controlled. In a private life, that can be joyful. In a political system built on discipline, it can look like a threat. So when Rome moved against the Bacchanalia, it was not only policing a cult, it was defending a worldview. A world where the Senate approved the gathering. A world where religion stayed visible. A world where community could exist, but only under Roman supervision. That's the real answer to the question. Rome shut down the public worship of a wine god because the worship itself had become a test of state power, and the Senate passed that test by making an example of it. Now you can see why this story still matters. It's not about ancient drunkenness. It's about how governments react when belief becomes organized, emotional, and hard to monitor. And if you want the next layer of this story, the next video goes even deeper into another Roman panic. The time they thought imported gods could literally poison the Republic. Because once Rome learned to fear one secret cult, it started looking at every foreign ritual differently. And that fear would reshape the empire for centuries.